everyone, welcome back. So I'm just going to finish off reviewing in a different key now from where I left off in my previous video. So the neurodiversity movement argument owed its existence to the recognition of Asperger's syndrome as the boundaries around the condition grew. Then, in 2013, Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis was killed off by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There were continued doubts about the usefulness of the concept. From the start, it had failed to meet a basic requirement: to mean the same thing every time it was used. The same problem that had plagued the understanding of autistic traits from the very beginning. There was a lack of agreement on whether everyone was even talking about the same thing. Hans Asperger had never drawn up a strict list of criteria for his syndrome. And the psychiatrist Lorna Wing, in the 1980s and 90s, attempted to do so when she brought Asperger's to the world attention, as did the Swedish Christopher Gillberg and the DSM-4. None of these varied lists of criteria was quite the same as any other. Clinicians giving out labels were making judgments based on their understanding of what Asperger's syndrome should look like. There was low objectivity. In one study, researchers found that using DSM-4 criteria, even Asperger's own original 4 cases would not qualify for the Asperger's diagnosis. And clinicians were ignoring the DSM definition and diagnosing with definitions influenced by the literature and popular belief, so it was not useful as a diagnosis. And all of this was the main reason, really, why Asperger's syndrome was removed as a category from the DSM in 2013. And obviously the possibility that Hans Asperger was a Nazi just added extra ammo to that decision. So, as I said earlier, the book covers heavily the life of Donald Triplett, who was the very first autistic case study. The book begins with his life and it ends with his life's ending. And it's really interesting because Donald Triplett actually had a very successful life. Obviously, he had a very difficult beginning, and his parents were at a loss as to what to do with him. He was even actually sent to an institution for a period of time until his parents decided that just wasn't the right place for him, because back in the day, a child like Donald would be sent off to an institution. That's what, out of sight, out of mind, as it were. That's what all the psychiatrists recommended. But it was a good thing that the parents removed him from the institution, and he'd actually ended up doing some farm work for a friend, and he actually thrived. He remained very autistic, but he had a very good life, and he learned a lot of things, and he developed, and he very much kind of had a good life. He was very happy. He didn't appear to have any mental illnesses or anything like that. He wasn't depressed or anything. But as I say, his parents were very successful. They were upper class Americans, and they had the power and the influence to ensure that Donald had the best life possible. Obviously, if they were in a different class, a lower social class, that may well not have been possible, and Donald could have spent his life in an institution. He actually learned to drive aged 27 in 1960. He was taught by his mother. And one after another, he met the milestones of growing up. He finished high school, he went to college, he even began a job, but the job was at his parents'. He worked with his family, so it was heavily supported. He helped out at a bank where his family worked. He did all of these milestones way after everyone else, but he did get there with a lot of support. Yet he still did not look people in the eye, he had an odd way of walking, and he had abrupt and also very abrupt exits from conversations. He majored in French. He was actually pretty good at foreign languages, and that was an ironic choice given his inability to hold a true conversation. He survived in part by scoring well on the vocabulary part of the exams, where he could count on his rote memory. And as I said, he went to work in his family-owned bank. As long as the family controlled the bank, no matter how erratic his performance, Donald could stay. He also loved golf. That was his big interest and passion, golf. And then his parents died. And he never showed much emotion at the funerals of either of his parents. He later said, "It was rather expected. I wasn't really downhearted or weeping or anything like that." And that was an interesting observation, actually, because I was actually quite similar when my mum died. Now, of course, that was a very, very upsetting period of life for me, don't get me wrong. And I processed it in my own way, and it was very, very difficult. But I didn't show emotion like other people did. I was very matter of fact about it. I didn't get really, really downhearted or anything. So I wonder if that's like an autistic thing. Not for all people, I want to make this very clear. Autism is very different. You might be autistic watching this and say, no, I react very strongly, I react in a more typical way. Everyone's different. I'm just talking about my experience. And obviously that of Donald actually mirrors my experience here. So it is possible that for some autistics, they do react in a different way, say at funerals or things like that. Because as Donald said, it was rather expected, and I knew my mum was dying. She had cancer. I'd already processed it before she died. And I was very kind of matter of fact and very kind of logical about it. So didn't maybe display the kind of emotions that other people were expecting, which can look like you don't care, and it's nothing to do with that. You do care, you care deeply, but it's just a different way of expressing it. So Donald, by the way, as I said, he was an American. He came from Mississippi, southern small town, but his family being very rich obviously helped him. Because in a small southern town, if you're odd and poor, you are deemed to be crazy. But if you're odd and rich, you are deemed to be eccentric. Yeah, it's very much a kind of class thing. And I think that's also the case in the UK as well, historically. Like, if you're rich or come from an upper social class, don't need to rely on welfare and stuff like that, and you have a mental problem, people kind of like just see you as eccentric, interesting. You know, like, for example, some very rich people, they have like, you know, those who live in like really big manor houses, and they're kind of like odd, autistic, and they might have huge collections and stuff, or things like that. No one really bats an eye, and it's just, oh, they're just a bit eccentric, you know, like a hermit, a bit strange, but people just see it as kind of quirky. But then if they're, say, poor and they have to rely on welfare or whatever, it's a different story, and then people see them very different light. So I thought that was quite interesting. In his 30s, he was often out of town as world travel became another hobby, so that's interesting. He was pretty independent, actually. He ended up travelling. He spent a lot of time travelling. He loved travelling. And he went at least a dozen times a year. He travelled solo in air, whale, by sea. So this is quite interesting. This is someone with classic autism. Obviously, in Donald's case, it doesn't look like he had a really severe intellectual disability or anything. He looks like, in a sense, if you want to put it like this, a very clear, very pure case of classic Kanner autism, which doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with an intellectual disability. It's possible that he did have some mild intellectual deficits, but it doesn't sound like he had a really severe intellectual disability, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do independent travelling, even with support and stuff. So that's quite interesting, but it's just interesting showing how this was the very first case study of classic autism, and it just shows how, you know, it's not necessarily a doom sentence. You know, obviously in Donald's case, he did really well. He actually seemed to have a really good life. But the key thing is that he was very, very well supported, and like I said, class could come into that a lot. And obviously, in fact, he obviously didn't have any really severe intellectual disabilities, which obviously meant that it was more a case of just pure autism in his case. But yeah, he appeared to travel with the aim of making contact with things, with all the statues and mountain tops that were seen in books, so not so much interested in people, it was more objects for him. And he organised all the photos from his trips into the albums. He loved collecting photos. And that's really how the book ends on Donald's life. And I thought it was very interesting because although in some ways I'm very different to Donald, there was actually a lot of similarity and a lot of things that I could relate to in Donald's life and my own development. Obviously, I'm a lot more verbal than he was, being more like the Asperger's kind of phenotype. But that aside, a lot of the other stuff very similar to my own experience. So that was quite interesting. So let me know what you think, and that's at the end of the review. So thank you for watching.